Behind those cozy nights at home, thousands of employees at BP go to work every day. People producing more U.S. natural gas. People building grid-scale solar capacity. People turning landfill waste gas into pipeline-quality renewable natural gas. And people delivering all of that power where it's needed. They're part of the more than 300,000 jobs BP supports across the country. Learn more at bp.com/investing in America.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/campaign to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Ducks Confidential Podcast. I'm James Crepea, joined as always by Ryan Clark as we take a look ahead to the regular season finale between number one Oregon and Washington. Obviously a matchup that very much needs no introduction, like many of the games this weekend, but the unusual circumstance of these two teams having the bye week in week 13 of a 14-week regular season, but alas, here we are. So they will meet on a 4:30 kickoff, Pacific time that is, of course, on NBC for the regular season finale. We'll touch on basketball as well, as obviously it's a pretty big week across the country. Similarly in football for all the rivalry matchups, a pretty big week in non-conference basketball matchups as well. So we'll get into that as both the Oregon men and women in MTE events this week in Hawaii and Las Vegas respectively. So we'll touch on those as well, but we'll obviously set up for after a bye week. Not much to obviously comment on without events per se, other than, of course, the looming question that's obvious for Oregon's purposes and for Washington for that matter. Really, every team is always health related. And naturally, Oregon has some prominent players who've been dealing with some health issues. Tez Johnson certainly alluding to the idea that he is back. If you want to read the tea leaves, it's not exactly very hard to interpret, but nevertheless, posting via Instagram and I believe some other platforms last week that he is back. So take that for what it's worth. Dan Lanning would not get into that too much, really wouldn't even comment on it at all. So we'll see what that means for Tez Johnson. Same, of course, for Jordan Birch. Didn't see him at Wisconsin. For all of those who want to play general manager and say, well, you didn't need him for it and better to arrest him for it and all those sorts of things. Look, he didn't play. As for what motivation, strategy, or otherwise, bottom line is if you don't think that one of the best players in the conference and by talent, the best player on the team just didn't want to, come on, no. So
yeah, he's the guy that wants to put some stuff on tape too. So it's not like, they're just waiting and waiting and waiting with Birch. It's like if he's ready to go, he's going to want to play. This guy's a competitor. So
yeah. So needless to say, again, a couple of guys and not to look past Marcus Harper as well, who's obviously missed a couple of games now since getting hurt late in the game at Michigan, which is now north of 3 weeks ago. So several prominent players on both sides of the ball dealing with injuries, not exactly a unbelievable concept, given that it is week 14 of the regular season. Many, many, many teams dealing with injury situations, some far more significant than what Oregon's dealing with. Hopefully, as many, if not all, of those players and more get back. And to say nothing of the other aspect of things that you get towards the end of the regular season is, of course, red shirts and players who are sitting on the 4 games to where they're preserving the red shirt and players who still have at least one still left to play. So rosters get shorter naturally, both by injury and by the red shirt situation. That gets alleviated for Oregon's purposes in the Big Ten championship game and then anything thereafter in terms of the postseason, because those games don't apply to the 4-game red shirt rule. So in some of these positions, like we talk about at receiver specifically, something where, for instance, Ryan Pelham was already sitting on 4 games. So in terms of managing around, whether Tez Johnson is back, not, or otherwise, to go back to the Wisconsin game, he wasn't. Okay, well, But when you have other players who are at the position who you're trying to preserve red shirts for, among other issues, yeah, it lends itself to roster management that gets difficult at this time of year. Again, not an unusual circumstance for Oregon specifically, just everybody, but something else to bear in mind as Oregon wraps up the regular season here. There are a couple of players sitting on 4 games by way of red shirts that it's just going to be part of the personnel management here for this week specifically.
Yeah. And it's a huge couple of weeks, too. You think about the magnitude not only of this game for what it means for Dan Lanning to get that monkey off his back with playing Washington and obviously beating a rival, finishing the regular season undefeated, and carrying that momentum into the Big Ten championship game. And of course, that being a week later and that being, undecided by way of the opponent, more likely Ohio State, but we'll see how next weekend plays out. Anything's possible. This is massive for everything, for playoff positioning, for the opportunity for Oregon to come into the Big Ten and win it in its first year. And then of course this week, which of course is their only focus, as they would, I'm sure, say publicly, is that Washington team, which I think is coming in with a lot of momentum and coming in with a desire to put a blemish on that perfect record for Oregon and to continue the trend against Dan Lanning. I mean, what a great feather in the cap of Jed Fish that would be in a season that's been pretty up and down for the Huskies to do that. But Oregon, I think, is going to come in very rested, prepared, an ability to have those guys that even weren't on the injury report that you and I didn't mention, get a little bit of time to get some of the rust off and knock some of the dings off, because I mean, you get to this point in the season, and Dan was one of the first to point it out. Everybody's banged up, especially in the trenches, but everybody's banged up. Everybody across the country is dealing with it. And so, this Washington game in particular, I think is going to be an exciting send off for the fans at Autzen Stadium. Of course, the possibility still exists of that playoff home game should the Ducks lose the Big Ten championship game. But either way, a fun way to end what's been a really exciting regular season.
Yeah, and if you want to get into the swings of what's at stake specifically for this week, I mean, you could say, well, what are the stakes on Oregon's side? After all, they have a spot clinched in Big Ten championship game, and it certainly appears as though a spot clinch in the playoff. It would take even if Oregon were to lose this week and in the Big Ten championship game, even if they were extremely lopsided outcomes somehow, I cannot envision a scenario, given what the field is looking like right now, given that there's already a glut of 3-loss teams involved. I simply cannot envision a scenario where Oregon would drop out of the 12-team field.
Yeah,
at this point,
there'd be like no way, even with the 2 losses, even if they suffered some, like, God forbid, major injury or something. Like, there's, with the way this Oregon team's played, and like you pointed out, the field around them, that 8 through 12 range and stuff is a bloodbath, and is going to potentially have a couple of 3-loss teams getting in there. And so, like, it's it would take a lot, and I don't think that a lot is even really going to happen. First and foremost,
I don't even think it's forget about predictability of what will and won't. I just don't even think it's possible. Even if on top of their losses, if Boise State were to fall all over itself and not make the field, so the quality of that win goes that, like, any number of scenarios that you could come up with, I simply don't see a scenario where Oregon could actually drop out of the playoff field. But until it's actually official, you got to, at least put it this way, until you finish off a 12-0 regular season and then make it to a conference championship game where at worst you're 12-1, you can't say it's absolute, but from a practical standpoint. All right, so then what's at stake? Well, not for nothing. Yeah, there are 3 straight losses in this series. And the number, obviously who's on the other sideline and the sheer volume of players and the roster of people that Washington went through. Not that any Oregon fans are going to be sympathetic to that, but point is there's no carryover from Kalen DeBoer or most anybody who played for Washington in a prominent role either of the past 2 years. There's a couple of players. Yes, there are a couple of players, including a couple of defensive players who've been around for a couple of years. But for the most part, most everybody's gone. So you can't even get into, well, there's this resonance. Now, of course, Jabbar Muhammad played there, and now he's over at Oregon. So, yes, I'm not saying there aren't storylines and things to be had. I'm saying in terms of like, oh, well, they want this get back against this person, this coach, this player. No. Against the brand, against the logo, against the rival, of course. But in terms of making it more personalized, there's not a lot of that either way. There just isn't.
I think there is for Dan. I mean, he might not admit it, and he might think of it as much more minor in the grand scheme than obviously they're more lofty and important goals. But you know, I'm sure that a guy like him, there's even a little bit of an itch to say, okay, not only do I want to go out and beat these guys, but I want to beat them pretty soundly. And for all the talk of people who obviously don't know how this program operates, but for people on the outside who have talked about them resting starters and, you know, going a little easier in this game. No. For a number of reasons, not the least of which being they want to maintain a healthy level of momentum on both sides of the ball going into the Big Ten championship. But additionally, you know, putting up a nice big number and blowing the doors off of what I think has been a pretty scrappy Washington team these last few weeks, that would do wonders not only for the team's confidence but for its belief.
Oh, again, given that it's 3 losses, and that is the number one thing against Lanning by way of his track record in his tenure at Oregon, by far. I mean, it's not even close. Losing to your rival in those 3 meetings is the number one thing. Absolutely. But ultimately, this is not against DeBoer and Penix and the receiving core that was there and what have you. And I'm sure in a long enough timeline, animus may ever develop, but truth be told, Dan gets along with Jedd Fisch. I'm not saying they're best of friends, but there's not vitriol. There's not hatred. There's not, like I say, there's not real animus there. Case in point, even though he since deleted it, on Sunday, Jedd Fisch retweeted a video of Dan Lanning in a coaching clinic going over certain concepts. Now, he has since removed it because, well, whatever, that's for him to speak to. But ultimately, whether he was just taking notes and inadvertently clicked on something or whatever. But bottom line, like, they get along. They're not, like I say, these are not guys who are at each other's throats on a day-to-day. Whereas, for instance, I think the matchup with Ohio State, while not historically a rival, certainly has all of the accoutrement to make for something in the years to come. But on the recruiting trail, they're at each other's throats for half of each other's recruiting classes.
Yeah, and for a competitive that first game was, and for the opportunity to exist to even potentially play each other 3 times this season, that could be the foundation on which a legit rivalry with that program is built, that even surpasses Washington, depending on how the future goes for Washington.
Yeah, you got the regional, be a long timeline.
Yeah, it's a long timeline, and it requires both programs to sort of maintain the track that they're on and everything else. And we'll see, you know, however things go for Ohio State, you know, what their leadership looks like in the future too. I mean, it all is variable for sure. But I mean, 3 games against the same team in one season, if that were to happen, would be pretty remarkable, particularly given the sort of, you know, peak and histories of them. So
it would definitely add some ingredients to it. And as far as the Big Ten championship game is concerned and the various scenarios, by the time Oregon plays on Saturday evening, should Ohio State beat Michigan, which you take nothing for granted in that rivalry either, but given the state of the 2 programs and that Ohio State is favored at home by 3 touchdowns, should that hold true, and that result be the case, then Oregon will know its opponent in the Big Ten championship game before kickoff, if it is indeed Ohio State. If Ohio State loses, then there's the possibilities of Then you're going into Penn State, which also you will have an outcome by that game thereafter. And in the event that somehow, some way, both Michigan beats Ohio State and Maryland beats Penn State, neither of which are statistically terribly likely, but should those things occur, then all you have to do is rely on Indiana to lay the lumber to Purdue to secure its spot in the Big Ten championship game at that point. And if none of those things happen, then it's still Ohio State in the end anyway. But bottom line, Oregon should, in all likelihood, know its Big Ten championship game opponent before it even kicks off on Saturday. I don't think that will have any impact on the game whatsoever. No. But for those who are planning accordingly or who have booked travel to Indianapolis or whatever the case may be, and just wanted to have, otherwise distract themselves before a 4:30 local time kickoff, you will have ample opportunities to do so. And I don't think you're going to have to be stressing too much about Indiana and Purdue because... Yeah.
And if there's anything that Oregon fans want more of, it's clinching scenarios, because as we know, there's been so much clarity and communication by way of those in this past week, and it's been a funny thing, and I definitely do want to touch on that as well. The idea that the scenarios were so complicated that it took 3 days following that Wisconsin win for the Big Ten to come to that conclusion, which we thought was the case going in. Then it wasn't. Then it was, and the dust cleared, and there it was. They had, in fact, clinched and could have celebrated that on Saturday in Madison if they wanted to. But hey, it's a lot of math that was required there to run through every scenario for all 18 teams.
Add to the long list of things that the Big Ten, for all of its bluster, that the conference office has just called what it is. They haven't done a good job. They haven't. In any number of aspects, from an operations standpoint, over the last year, there are any number of things that the league office could do better, should do better, needs to do better. I mean, bottom line, if this was the Pac-12, can you imagine the vitriol, the criticism, and all the butt-ended jokes that there would have been? Had the Pac-12 league office not known a team secured a spot in its championship game for 72 hours? And just call it what it is. So just because it's a Big Ten and just because it's more money and just because of its history doesn't mean it's above criticism. Whether that be for not knowing the math of its own tiebreakers fast enough, whether it be for highly inequitable schedules. I mean, you realize the only two power conference teams who had buys this past week were Oregon and Washington. So let's not act like this is normal in a 2-bye season that this is happening. It's not. And now I appreciate that there are those who are trying to spin it now as, after stating for so long that it was highly disadvantageous to have the bye as late as it was, now it's the, well, look at the upside. They got the bye late. Now they can refresh, recharge, what have you, before regular season finale, before conference championship game, and naturally as a fan, you're presuming winning the conference championship game, and then an even longer hiatus before the quarterfinals. All right, look at it however which way you wish. The bottom line is, if you had to draw up a schedule before any of those things occurred, you would never have put the second bye in week 13, particularly when there were 8 solid weeks before that. Be that as it may, that is where they find themselves. That is all out of Oregon's control. And they deserve credit for the things that they did achieve along the way, which I think have been lost to some extent, even insofar as in the last couple of days, you're already starting to see conjecture about from here, there, and everywhere, from every corner. Well, Ohio State's playing better. Ohio State should be number one, even though they lost heads up. Well, so outcomes don't matter? Don't matter. To some folks, I don't understand that, to be honest. If you want to do a power ranking and suggest something, that's one thing, but power rankings are not standings, power rankings are not how you should seed a playoff. I say all that, but of course, power rankings were kind of how the committee decided a playoff last year. So what do I know? I mean, because if it goes by merit, well, we all know that's not exactly how it went last year.
Yeah, and everybody's going to be upset about something, right? No matter how far you expand it. But yeah, I mean, there's a reason they play the football games. There's a reason that they line up between the lines. And will this game perhaps feel different and even potentially be more difficult for Oregon, if that's even possible to be more difficult than a 1-point win early in the season? Yeah, I mean, I think these are both different teams. And if we're talking about Ohio State versus Oregon and it being the most likely matchup in this Big Ten championship game, I think Oregon is a lot better than they were at that point in the season. And I think Ohio State in the last few weeks has really come on and reached a point of being a better team than they were at that point. So it will be a different game, yes, but I don't think it'll be any less competitive. I think it's going to be the same type of game. I feel like, between these two. Now, could that be different way down the road in a rubber match of some sort? Then yeah, maybe. But these are two similar teams, similarly built, both incredibly talented and experienced, and reaching their peaks in terms of performance right at the right time. So.
And of course, another one where we'll get into that more next week, regardless of who the matchup is with. But from an injury standpoint, just as much as we talk about what we'll get updates by way of Oregon's personnel this weekend, look, Ohio State's got its issues as well, to say the least. I mean, obviously, its offensive line has been ravaged. It was already dealing with injuries before. It's just continues to get worse by way of just sheer manpower and bodies. Now, they held up well against Indiana, but let's not kid ourselves by way of let's see how Ohio State does against Michigan in its defensive front in a rivalry game and the like, in a game, again, that they're expected to win and win handily because of how inept Michigan's offense is. Let's see how that looks before proclaiming one thing or the other about Ohio State's line of scrimmage play on either side of the ball. That said, Oregon, I don't know if they're playing that much better than they were in that game. Frankly, I thought they played really well in that game. I think they're pretty similar. If Jordan Birch is back, not just this week, but for the Big Ten championship game, to say nothing of Tez Johnson as well, then that's a significant addition, because if you can trot out there with both Jordan Birch and Mateo on the field against an Ohio State offensive line that is as banged up as it is. Now, granted, that's mainly on the interior spots, but be that as it may, if you can do that, that's quite advantageous in said hypothetical rematch. But we'll get into that more next week once, again, we know things for sure officially. For this week, for the matchup with Washington, start first and foremost. I don't think you're going to get any clarity as to who Washington's quarterback is in this game until Saturday night. I cannot imagine a scenario where Jed Fish is going to come out and proclaim who their starter is for this game. And for those who are new to the conversation and new to the situation, Will Rogers, transfer from Mississippi State, started his career there and was quite productive under Mike Leach. Transferred to Washington for his final year, trying to recapture some of that production and some of that magic. It has absolutely not come to fruition at all for the young man. Started off the season far better than he has for the last month and a half. And in the win over UCLA, now a week plus ago, was pulled in that game. And Damon Williams, the freshman quarterback for the Huskies, who has played in every game this season, albeit in limited capacities. Iowa was the one where he had the longest run by way of plays and particularly pass plays. But Rodgers had started every which game and, again, had solid production early in the year. That's when their receivers got off to a really nice start, and you heard a lot out of Seattle about how great their receivers were, and then that cooled down significantly. Well, yeah, Damon Williams took over and did well in the albeit small sample, but did well to close that game in a win over UCLA. And they ended it whereby Jed was saying, not making a decision, certainly not publicly, and didn't imagine he'd be declaring it at any point before the game with Oregon. And again, we'll see what comes out of Seattle this week, but I can't imagine he's going to suddenly turn around and make it easier for Dan Lanning and Tosh Lupoi to prepare. So you're looking at a two-quarterback situation that's been a two-quarterback situation all season. And regardless of who starts, even if it is Damon Williams, who's to say that they wouldn't put Will Rogers in just as they had before with Damon Williams coming into games? I mean, it's entirely possible.
Yeah, it is. And you have the challenge to prepare for either of them and to be able to react accordingly within the game. And that is all certainly part of the picture. But the way that this Oregon defense has played these last few games in particular, just continually rising to be one of the best in the country. If they can just continue to build on what happened at Wisconsin, and especially getting Birch back, if they can add some pressure to the mix, and it shouldn't for them matter who's out there, but it is something by way of game planning and by way of reactivity that you're coming off a bye. You might not be as sharp as if you've been on the week-to-week schedule before and just grinding through the games. It is certainly something to keep an eye on, and it could lead to challenges in sort of the middle eight of the game as things continue to change around.
Well, stylistically, they're just two very, 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 very different players. Yeah. And Rodgers is the prototypical pocket passer. He does not run the football whatsoever. His rushing stats naturally are negative numbers because when he gets sacked, he loses yards, period, end of sentence. Damon Williams is very much not a pocket passer. He is a dual threat. He's the more athletic of the two. And that's why, naturally, Washington fans are awfully optimistic about what his capabilities are because, he poses a dual threat. And when you have that out there, what that does for the run game with Jonah Coleman, who's a 1,000-yard rusher on the season, and what that could offer some things, and how that presents challenges to opposing defenses. If you're dealing with a pocket passer, I don't care what the receiving core. Washington's receiving core has some nice players in it. Look, don't look past them. Denzel Boston's had a nice season. His production in the last several games is not what it was to start the year, but nevertheless, Giles Jackson's a talented player. Jeremiah Hunter, formerly a Cal, talented player. They've got some talented wideouts. But if you've got a pocket passer and you're trying to have extended plays, again, if Birch is back and with all the other players that Oregon has on the defensive line, let alone the front seven as a whole, that's going to be tough sledding for a pocket passer who doesn't have much by way of mobility. Now, if it's Williams, whether it be to start or longer capacity or whatever the case may be, not to say that he couldn't also try to stretch the field a little bit, but you have a player who's more apt to run, move the pocket, escape pressure, you name it, just a more mobile player. And not for nothing, one of the things that Oregon has struggled with this year, even with not the most athletic of quarterbacks at times, is mobile quarterbacks. And that doesn't make them unique in that way. There's plenty of defenses who struggle with that. But let's put it this way. If you're Oregon's defense, not knocking Will Rogers, I'm talking about just stylistically speaking, you would prefer to be dealing with the pocket passer. That's just a more predictable situation compared to the, comparatively speaking, more athletic Williams. You'd rather deal with Rogers.
Yeah,
because your edge rushers know exactly where he's going to be.
Yeah, especially with how things went against Wisconsin. Like you didn't have that real worry against the Badgers, and to maintain that in this game would be obviously a benefit to Oregon. And just having less to deal with and to game plan for is always a benefit for the Ducks. And I think that this will be a nice test for the Oregon secondary by way of open field tackling, but also just coverage downfield and trying to contain these guys. This is something that they've done such a great job of against even more talented rosters than the one that Washington brings in. But this game in particular will be a nice test ahead of facing potentially that vaunted Ohio State core again, if they do.
And on the other side of the ball, Look, we're not going to rattle through all the names. Bottom line is, again, there's been massive roster upheaval, but there are a couple of names defensively for Washington that, again, for those who are certainly been paying attention the last couple of years, you'll recognize a couple. Carson Bruner at the top of the list, of course, by way of production and been around for several years. And there are a couple of others as well. But bottom line, this is not the Washington defense of the past couple of years. It just isn't. It just isn't. And again, given the amount of roster of people, it would have been foolish to suggest that it would be, because you got to be fair. I mean, they lost an absolutely unreal amount of talent on both sides of the ball. But be that all as it may, it's certainly not the strength of the team by any stretch of the imagination. In some of its losses, the defense has looked, in certain cases, downright bad. Having said that, look, this is a rivalry. And it's a rivalry that, for the most part, with very limited exception, the better team has won the game. The team favored to win, particularly in more lopsided matchups, last season notwithstanding. The better team has won. There really have not been a long list of unbelievable upsets in this series. There haven't been. And if you want to go back to look, after all, Jed Fish was at Arizona previously, and they coached against them there, both with Dan and with Mario before that. Look, there's some good coaches on that staff. They may not have all the weapons at their disposal just yet to make a lot of that happen. But if you want to go back to Jed's first year at Arizona, I mean, look, remember, they came into Otson. I know it was Cristobal, it's a different situation. Oregon's talent's different. Yeah. But they came in with a unbelievably depleted, I believe the quarterback may have been hurt in that game, if memory serves me correctly. I think McLeod, who has since transferred like 3 times over. They came in and had a relatively speaking, fairly competitive game in that game. So Jed Fish and his staff also coming off a bye. I'm not making anything extra of the 12 extra hours or whatever it was by way of preparation for this. They're coming off a bye. They get an opportunity to be prepared too. And of course, it means something to them in a rivalry in the locker room. And yeah, they've already got the bowl eligibility. And yes, these are two teams that, from a pure talent standpoint, there is no argument to be had. One's the number 1 team in the country. One is looking down the barrel at 6-6. There's no pretending that these are teams on equal footing right now. There isn't. But it's college football. And wild things do happen. Case in point, this past weekend, the number of absolutely wild outcomes that occurred in games that had very big point spreads in the other direction. Things do happen.
Yeah, and those
I'm not suggesting that
games.
it will. Yeah, that too. And I'm not suggesting that it will. Just saying, taking things for granted is usually you can set yourself up for disappointment sometimes when that occurs.
You can, so. And the Oregon offense too, like with how difficult things were at times against Washington throughout the game, I think that there is that added edge to regain their rhythm specifically. Look, the defense has been playing well, and that should carry over. But if the Oregon offense is going to, want to produce as well as they have once they get to that Big Ten championship game, this game is a nice little opportunity for them to recapture that momentum. And if Tez plays or not, we'll see. It seems, based on the tea leaves, as you called them, or perhaps the Instagram story leaves, that indeed he will. We're not going to get anything before the game from coaches or otherwise about that, but we'll hear from Dan tonight. This, of course, being Monday when we record. But whether he's there or not, look, they have the weapons and they have the guys to score a lot of points against this UW team. Now, the game plan on Fish's part, I think, is going to be strong, but how can Oregon overcome that? How can they get all these weapons involved, get Dylan Gabriel back into a nice rhythm after kind of a tough game where he had a few forced throws? That's such a big focus, I think, for them. It's about more than finishing undefeated for them. It's about having that type of momentum that they need for the postseason, coming off of a bye and wanting to capture it.
Look, if you call it what it is, if you're Washington, if you're on that staff in particular, offensively speaking, I mean, you have more at your disposal than Wisconsin, that's for sure. However, you would absolutely try to do what Wisconsin was doing, just better. Better by way of execution and results, better by way of strategy. And again, Fish had tried to do that. Go back to his days at Arizona when they came to Autzen back in 21. Yeah. If you're Washington, you are trying to play a possession style of game here. You want to keep Oregon's offense off the field, especially if Tez Johnson is back. Because you are trying to avoid the explosiveness, particularly in the vertical passing game, that Oregon has not been able to show the last couple of weeks with Tez not in the lineup. If he's back and this offense is able to produce at the levels that it was at that point, well, then no, Washington can't keep up with that. They are not going to be able to keep up with it. So if you're on that side of the ball, you are trying everything to, whether run with Williams in particular, run with Coleman, run as much as possible, be efficient in the passing game, get to the perimeter where you can, and keep the clock moving. And those are things, like I say, defensively, they certainly did quite well at preventing that against both Michigan and Wisconsin. Washington has much better receivers. much better receivers as receiving cores. Maybe not tight end specifically, but much better receiving cores than either of those teams. And frankly, much better quarterback play than those teams. But stylistically speaking, no matter how much better they may be than those two, which are two of the least talented offenses in the league, yeah, but there's still a talent gap here. And if you're Washington, you're going to try and play a possession style of game much as you can, particularly if Tez Johnson's back, especially so. And that's where, if you're Oregon, yeah, you are trying to break any opponent, but especially an rival that you've lost to 3 straight meetings over the past 2 seasons. You want to break them from that tendency and strategy as fast as imaginable. And if you have your speed receiver back in the lineup and at your disposal to do so, then stretching the field vertically, which they have not been able to do very much the past couple of games, all of a sudden, if that's back as a club in the proverbial bag, yeah, there's a quick way to break a team from a possession style of football. Build a significant enough lead to where they can't afford to be manipulating the clock anymore. That's it. With that in mind, it would not stun me if Oregon were to win the toss if they wanted the ball first. Because this is the kind of game and the kind of opponent that, stylistically speaking, you want to try to not just, you always want to play with the lead as early as possible. Yeah, but you want to try to make it impossible for an opponent who may try to employ a possession and clock strategy. You want to try to break them from that as quickly as possible. And not to say that if either Washington won the toss and wanted the ball for it first, or even if Oregon won the toss and deferred, that can't be done. No, but you can really make things extremely difficult with a quick score, a stop, and a score again, and you can put a team on its heels minutes into a game. Again, that could be said any given week, but when you're talking about more possession-style teams, or a team that may have to do that, maybe if that's not even always the way it's gone for Washington this season, but especially if they're relying on a freshman quarterback, on the road, at night, rivalry, number 1 team in the country, if the plan is to go out there and wing it 45 times, not sure that's a recipe for success. No matter how much more talented the receiving corps is compared to, again, some of the more inept offenses in the league, that notwithstanding. I would suspect that Washington will try to play a little bit more of a possession style for as long as it can. And if it can't, well, then, like I say, then I think the talent gap that exists will become very, very evident very quickly. And it will become a showcase of this Oregon offense and what it could look like when all things are clicking again. Which, look, call what it is. It's been a couple of weeks since you've seen that mainly because Tez Johnson hasn't been on the field. So if he's back, I have a feeling you're going to see that over and over again. And not just from Tez, but what he does to defenses and how he has to and how he stretches and stresses defenses open things up for other guys.
And he's a Duck through and through too. He's a guy that comes into a game against a team like this with an edge. You bet he does. So he
on his senior night.
Yeah, on his senior night, he's after it.
This is his last game at Autzen.
This is a chance to rack it up.
Barring the theoretical, last regular season game, we could go down the rabbit hole.
They want it to be the last one.
Yes,
no doubt.
Very much are anticipating it being as such. So, having said all that, we will certainly get into and review the matchup next week and the game that was, and of course the matchup that will be in the Big Ten championship game with whoever that opponent may be. We'll get into that more next week, but shifting gears, we'll get into basketball a little bit. On the men's side, it wouldn't be a trip to Corvallis if it didn't go down to the last score. So that's now just shaping up to, it doesn't matter what month, doesn't matter what conference, it doesn't matter. Just Oregon and Oregon State will play a one-score game at Gill Coliseum. That is now just the way it is. Now, it'll be probably 2 years until that trip again, with the circumstances being what they are. But be that as it may, another thriller, another just really exciting college basketball game environment and circumstances and the like from a absolutely abject, miserable first half for Oregon, especially defensively speaking, where Oregon State, again, Dana Altman called it embarrassing. I mean, and he's right. I mean, that was just ugly for Oregon's purposes defensively in the first half. And to completely flip that on its head in the second half, flip turnovers and points off turnovers, a total 180. And for what had been years of who would be that player to rise to the occasion. And the first couple of years, it was unsung guys. It was Eric Williams Jr. It was Rivaldo Soares. And not just guys by way of unsung, by way of roles on those teams, but especially in the course of those games. A couple of years ago when Soares hit the three late, he was having a bad night. And he comes through with a huge moment. Last season, Dante, yes, it comes as to quite literally a last-second dunk. But, Dante was having a good night and obviously had a tremendous season. Here, if you had to pick who the players are going to be on this Oregon team who are going to come through in those moments, for it to be the two Oregonians and the longest tenured member on the roster in Nate Biddle, and for a lot of fans, especially, I would say the face of the program. I don't know if he necessarily is. I don't want to put that on Jackson Shelstad necessarily, because this is a pretty balanced roster. But one game after he didn't score for the first time in his career, on a night where he started, I believe it was 0 for 4 from 3, before he then caught fire late, they take over and close out a terrific comeback. And they're down 12 with about 13:45 to go. And 11 with, I believe it was 10:45 or 11:45 to go. And it ain't looking pretty. But they completely flip it. They each take the game over in a huge way. And that's not to look past what Keyshawn Barthelemy did for them in the first half. And, again, what a terrific comeback. Again, an exciting finish at Gill Coliseum in general, and an Oregon win that improves them to 5-0. And they head off to the Players Era Festival in Las Vegas at MGM Grand Garden Arena, where they open up with number 20 Texas A&M on Tuesday. They'll play San Diego State on Wednesday, and then a to-be-determined opponent all the way until Saturday. So it's a week-long extravaganza for the Oregon men in Las Vegas, where it's the start of the competition really taking a significant step up. And that's not to look past Oregon State either, who credit to them, not just for that game in general, but they are clearly a better team than not just a year ago, I'd say, than probably even the past couple of years. So that was a better opponent than the prior 4 opponents. Oregon has had its moments of scares already this season. The competition goes up this week in Las Vegas, and you have back-to-back games, Tuesday, Wednesday. Then, frankly, they come back, and you've got games at USC and a home game with UCLA. So there are significant tests for the Oregon men in a hurry. These next couple of weeks are major games in terms of their non-conference and even the start of their conference schedule into December, where they're 5-0 right now. Their next 5 games are all quality, significant games, really significant games. I realize it's a down USC team, relatively speaking, but you still got to go down there. This is going to be a significant next couple of weeks for this Oregon men's team, who is picking up votes in the polls, but again, there's usually like 50 teams who pick up votes in the polls in November and December. You'll get an early idea. I believe it's both the men and the women will be next week. Definitely the men for sure. You'll get an early idea of the net metric gets released next week. So not just by the results that we'll be able to go over as well, you'll get a very early indicator as to net rankings and the like, good or bad.
Yeah.
As to what that looks like. Yeah,
these are big ones for the men, and it'll be fun for them probably to be down in Vegas, even if maybe they'd like to be home for Thanksgiving, maybe hit the Wicked Spoon buffet instead. But that, going back, I guess, to that rivalry game against Oregon State and the exciting nature of it that you touched on, and the continually exciting nature of it, I do think it's made all the more richer by it being 2 Oregonians, 2 guys that are local in Shellstad and Biddle, coming up clutch in those games. I think it's an extension of what is an exciting and often overlooked, prep basketball scene in Oregon. I think back to my time, in high school, going to those games, whether it be at Child Center or at the Moda Center or whatever, and carrying through into the modern era, and these guys that are going D1 and players on the girls basketball side too that have been really exciting in the last decade in the state. So I think that's exciting for 2 reasons. One, it's an extension of that sort of basketball culture in the state, and 2, it allows the rivalry itself between Oregon and Oregon State to thrive in a better way than in a lot of other sports, especially football. But women's basketball, they don't play this year. And those are 2 programs that are pretty, which is absolutely a shame. And is two programs there that have their own history in the last several years, including obviously what Scott Rook was able to achieve before he got, annihilated, unfortunately, in the transfer portal this past season. But yeah, it's a strengthening of the rivalry, and something that, for all the issues that Oregon State faces by way of keeping its head above water in athletics, they have that edge and that excitement that comes with those men's basketball games in particular. So that was a lot of fun to watch for sure.
One thing I'll say by way of the environment that was, look, I credit Oregon State for a couple things. One, for the game in general and the team and their players, first and foremost. But environment-wise and the like, hey, thinking outside the box and doing a ticket giveaway and a promo with that game as a springboard for other games, hey, you got to do what you got to do. It's a shame that you have to, but if that's what you got to do in order to get more people in the building, especially get them in early to then entice them to come back around a second time, so be it. That okay. Again, you would prefer for it not to be the case, but if it is, fine. No problem. Hey, they started off the season nicely too, and they're still off to a nice start. That should have been a better crowd. Should have been a bigger crowd. And the people who were there made for a nice environment and the like, and the students had a good showing, and etc. But less than 7,000 people were there. Not for nothing. Was there something else going on? Was there some other massive event I'm unaware of? No. Team's gotten off to a nice start, a really nice start. And they're clearly better than the past couple of seasons. If you're not going to show up for 4-0 versus 4-0 in the in-state rivalry game in November, what are you going to show up for? And that goes for both fan bases, by the way. Look, Ducks fans were there, a good number of them, and more could have been there too. That was a game that, under the circumstances, not just because of the way it played out, I'm talking about even heading into it. It's the one time they're going to meet this year. The prior 3 years, whenever they played there, it had gone down to the wire. Lo and behold, it did again. And they were both undefeated going into the game. And by early metrics, Oregon State is a top 100 team right now. What happens over the course of the season, we'll find out. But bottom line, like, they've gotten off to a nice start. You're not talking about 4-0 against 1-3. Like, that was shaping up on paper, entering that game, to be an exciting kind of matchup. And for the crowd that was there, it was a good setting. It could have been that much better. That's one of the lower attendance numbers for this meeting when the series is played in Corvallis. That's one of the lower attendance numbers over the last 20 years, 25 years. I went back and looked. Yeah, there was a lower one only a couple of years ago, but there were not very many Oregon State men's basketball games in Corvallis since 2000 with less than 7,000 people. It's a shame that that's now almost becoming norm. It shouldn't be. That game deserved to have more people there. The players deserve, on both sides, deserve to have more people there. Again, and I credit for those who did show up and everything for making for the environment that it was. But that was the kind of game that should have had a bigger showing. Absolutely. Because, like, if you're not going to respond to when the team is off to a nice start, both teams off to a nice start, I don't care which fan base you're part of. If you're not going to show up, Oregon's been disappointed the last couple of years. It caught a nice run in order to reach the tournament and finish the year that it did last year. But if you're not going to show up when they're both undefeated in the one time they're going to play, what do you want? Other than a perfect time, perfect weather on a Saturday. You can't draw it up every ideal condition perfect. This is what you got. Again, for those who showed up, it was a very nice environment. But it would have been amplified if there were 8,500, 9,000 people there, is all I'm saying. And it could have felt that much bigger. That was the one part of it that I thought was, whether you want to say disappointing, I don't know if that's exactly the right word, but missing an element of. The crowd that was there was good. It could have been much better. And that's not blaming anybody. That's just stating a fact. There could have been more people in the building. There have been more people in the building when these teams weren't as good. That was one I was hoping, for the players' sake and for the program's sake, that there would have been a larger number than there was. But that's what it was. On the women's side, we can all be envious of the trip to Hawaii for the Oregon women, who head off to spend almost a week in Hawaii themselves after amid a very nice start. And also, we talk about quality of opponents taking a step up. The Ducks are 6-0, and it will not be easy. It wasn't easy to get to 6-0 for the win over Auburn in the first place. Another game that went down to the wire that you can certainly fill folks in on, Ryan, given that that was also an exciting one. But these games with Georgia Tech and South Dakota State, these are tournament caliber teams. This is not this is a pleasure cruise to Hawaii by way of the ambiance and the setting, but the opponents are not pushovers by any stretch.
Yeah, certainly not. And they had a few extra days leading into these games, which is nice. They weren't among the teams that sort of had to play on Saturday. They could really, get on island time a little bit with some of this stuff, and it seemed like they did some good team bonding. But yeah, this Ducks team, number 21 now, 6-0 on the season. That trip to Hawaii is no easy trip by way of opponents, as you noted. Georgia Tech and South Dakota State, both potential tournament teams. And opportunities for continual tests for this Oregon team that's had a few of them. I think that, the Lions' share of their games so far are against teams that either play in a conference that they have a good chance to win or are certified, NCAA tournament type teams between Auburn and Baylor and, some of the others on their schedule. I think that Kelly Graves has gone out of his way to sort of point that out to folks. Like, look, this hasn't just been a bunch of slouches that have come into our building the first 6 games of the season and we've beat them. They beat a number 12 at the time Baylor team. And I think, watching that Auburn team, all the players that they have on their roster and the talent and experience that they have, that's a tournament team. And there are potentially a couple of pros on that roster. Talia Scott, of course, being the top one among them. She had 28 points in that game for Auburn, but this Oregon team is gritty. They play tough defense. They have depth. They have individual players that play tough defense. Elisa Mevius is sort of the X factor defensively for them, an Olympic gold medalist and somebody with a ton of length and footwork and ability on the defensive end. She hits another clutch shot too. She hits the layup to give them the lead with a few seconds left, and they hold on to win. Despite Talia Scott's efforts, she hits a 3 to get to 28 points later in that game, and that was pretty unreal. But another player that has come on as she's gotten back into game shape following her preseason injury was Philippina Shea, who, when she's healthy, when she plays bigger minutes as she did against Auburn, against a Auburn front line that has some size, has some toughness, she's integral to what they do. And Kelly Graves even said it, like, she is somebody that, once healthy, could contend to lead the country in rebounding, not just because she's 6'8" and they fall into her hands, but because of her positioning, her strength, and what she's able to do down there. When she's healthy, I'm not saying these two players are anywhere close to the same by way of, the talent or potential at the pro level, but you think about what South Carolina had with Camila Cardoso and that type of big that, Shea's feet are a bit slower than Cardoso's, but she's somebody that can affect the game in those same ways and affecting shots more even than she's blocking them on the defensive end, and being that pick and roll partner for 2 scoring guards like Peyton Scott and Deja Kelly. Kelly, of course, has had a couple of rough games in a row, but she, I think, will end up being Oregon's leading scorer along with Scott. That's a dangerous team. And now that they have shooters, now that they have players like Nani Falatea healthy and others able to hit outside shots, including Scott, who I think has a great off the dribble game. This Oregon team is multiple. They're multifaceted. They're deep, and being able to maintain that and continue to play for each other and play balanced the way that they have these first 6 games is going to be the big challenge against these opponents in Georgia Tech and South Dakota State. And then you turn right around, and this game, unfortunately, is going to be lost to the eyeballs of other things on December 7th. And you got Juju Watkins and USC coming into town after, of course, you play Washington State December 4th, which is by no means a game to overlook. But these tests get a rolling, and it will continue to climb as Big Ten play gets going. But this is an Oregon team that has surprised people, and I think has a chance to continue to surprise people this season.
Yeah, and we talked about the things that the league office could have done better. Hey, there's going to be a couple of conference games early on. Fine. There is no way, none, for anybody to rationalize any team, SC included, whether they were home or road, doesn't matter to me. When you have one of the top teams in the country, and they are, it's a ticket draw for, if they're on the road, it's a ticket draw for that home team. There's no way anybody can rationalize that for me on the day of the conference championship game of football. None. There's going to be overlap in that game. There's no way anybody can rationalize that. That's a shame. And if you're a season ticket holder, I really feel for you. And that's the men and the women, because the men play UCLA the next day. If you're a season ticket holder for one or both of the basketball programs and you want to support the football team in Indianapolis, you're put up against it. And that was the same way in the Pac-12. And that didn't make it right then. It doesn't make it right now. People should not be put in that spot. And again, the school has nothing to say in this. They have no... They can get a early schedule. Here's what it could look like. What do you think about it? And provide some feedback. But they do not have the final say in this. So this is not Oregon or any other school saying yay or nay and we're all on board. They can say, we really don't like this. And the league office is going to turn around and say, tough.
Yeah,
these are things that can be navigated around.
They can, and from an equity standpoint, too, you're talking about the growth of women's basketball and the attention being paid to the sport, and a star of Juju Watkins' caliber that is that sort of person that can continue to carry that torch that players like Caitlin Clark and Sabrina Ionescu have carried in the past. You want the opportunity for more people to watch her and to watch the teams she plays and for their star to be elevated in the process. Somebody like Deja Kelly, who, could be one of the faces of college basketball were she to perform up to that level, just by simple, reach and, social media following and interest in broadcasting and all these things. Like, those sort of things can be elevated and the game can continue to grow and the stars can be appreciated for who they are when people are watching it. And this reminds me a lot of how, unfortunately, in American soccer, sometimes, the level of overlap can leave the women's soccer players hanging out to dry. And of course, that's by circumstance and situation in this particular case. But, when you have a sport that's growing the way it is, you definitely want to give more of a platform for them to play on. And you even mentioned it, I think, last week as a potential idea that, why not have a like round robin sort of bit of games for a couple of the teams that are in the Big Ten to play in Indianapolis, so that the folks that are there, you have a chance to maybe catch your team if both the football and basketball teams are lined up as such. Maybe have some kind of Big Ten challenge mid-season tournament type deal. Who knows? I mean, anything is possible, but being creative and at least scheduling the game on a different day where people aren't going to be traveling or caught up with something that, of course, is going to have way more eyeballs on it in terms of the Big Ten football championship. There's things you can do, and it's unfortunate they didn't in this case, and I would hope in the future that they would.
And last thing on the to that point, we're talking about attendance. Look, I understand, because the performance, specifically the women's team, the past couple of seasons, most especially last season, that plenty of fans were upset. Believe me, I have the emails and the direct messages to prove it. I know. After all, I was the one asking Kelly Graves about his job security as the season went on. All right. But he and his staff did go out and did address and did massively overhaul and did replenish a roster. And they have gotten off to a nice start. Now, it's not going to be instant. I understand people are going to have their reservations. I understand there's not going to be the same level of season ticket renewal, and et cetera, et cetera. And on a national scale, they may still rank okay in terms of attendance so far. But it's going to be hard because of the USC game being on the day of the Big Ten championship game. But, all right, before that, you do have Washington State. And after that, you have a couple of games later in December. This team's gotten off to a really nice start. It's in the top 25. It takes time to get people back around. But attendance, even on a national scale, if it's okay, hey, look, they're still in a pretty good spot, I understand. But relative to where they were, and I'm not going back to Sabrina's senior year or her junior year. I'm talking about even since then. Right now, the highest attendance of these first handful of games would be lower than the lowest attendance in any game in 21-22. Now, that team did make the tournament, but be that as it may. you really got to go back to like Sabrina's sophomore year to be where a lot of this is trending right now. Now, look, hopefully people take notice. Hopefully they keep it going, and you get more people back in the building again. You got to have to rebuild Rome a little bit.
And I do think that there has been somewhat of a trend of improvement over these couple of games after the Baylor game, too, just as an aside, because having been there and like seeing the crowd at the Auburn game, I think there was some level of improvement there. So, and I know that's not what you're saying,
well, based
obviously.
Based on the hard figures, Baylor was far and away the highest. And again, some of the games in between notwithstanding, it certainly is understandable. But
yeah, especially the field trip day game. It's 11 a.m. on a weekday.
It's understood. But point is that forget about where things rank nationally. Look, on the men's side, it ain't good either. It's not. And the West Coast schools are in for a rude awakening. A major rude awakening in men's basketball. Major. Because where the former Pac-12 schools who have joined the Big Ten, where they rank in attendance in the league, not good. Not good at all. Not surprising because of where they were historically and where the Pac-12 was historically. But shocker, the bottom four in the Big Ten for men's college basketball in attendance are the four West Coast schools. That's behind Northwestern. That's behind, way behind, Minnesota, who was picked last. And I mean way behind. USC is averaging less than half of that. And we're talking about Minnesota, who's picked last. We're not even getting into Michigan and Michigan State and Purdue and Wisconsin or Indiana, where they got 17,000 average attendance right now at home games. Oregon's averaging 56, just under 5,700. If you combined the four West Coast schools' average attendance right now, it would not beat Indiana by a massive margin. That's why I say rude awakening by some of these games. There's going to be higher quality opponents. That should hopefully put some more people in the building for Oregon's purposes, and all of the West Coast schools for that matter. But college basketball is a different breed in the Big Ten now. Caliber of play and level of passion and fervor around it in these buildings is wildly different, especially on the men's side. And for some of the top programs on the women's side also. So like I say, I'm pointing it out because we talk about it in one context or the other. Hey, hopefully as the calendar turns, conference play begins, and of course, ultimately, if the teams keep winning, then people will come back in the building. And I understand people's reservations for the women's team. I do. I understand it. I get it. Not naive to it. They're still ranking the top 25 nationally by way of attendance, but compared to where they were as a program 3 years ago, 7 or 8 years ago, still behind the curve. They got to win people over and get them back. On the men's side, I get it. A couple of years of struggles. Last year, they catch fire late, but different roster. Hey, they're off to a 5-0 start. We'll see what happens this week in Las Vegas, but ultimately, these are the things that, hey, if you want to make it tough when some of these better teams in the Big Ten do come to town, you got to show up. Got to show up. It's not just, if Arizona or UCLA come to town, it means something anymore. No, like virtually everyone in the league when they come to town. This is a different area of the Monopoly board playing college basketball now. That should be exciting. And I think it will be for a lot of folks. But so far, let's put it this way. Some of these things are not like the others. Yeah, the West Coast schools have not gotten off to a great start by way of bringing people into their buildings in non-conference play just yet, especially on the men's side. On the women's side, that's a different animal because, again, UCLA just obviously got a tremendous win. It's now the number one team in the country. SC is one of the top teams. It's a little bit different. But hopefully for both of these programs, they can keep things going, get people back in the building, and bring that excitement back because when it is a packed house, when it is pretty full, it's a loud building. It can create quite the home court advantage. But you got to do that with 8 and 10 and 12,000 people in the building, not 4 and 5,000 people in the building. That's a harder, there aren't going to be too many of the Big Ten men's teams who are going to walk in feeling terribly threatened in a building with 7,500 people in it. And that's not, they'll get a chuckle out of that compared to 15,000. I mean, come on now. So you got to create those environments again. And I'm sure once we get, past the new year and stuff, that'll come around. But some of these games are rapidly approaching, I say, only a matter of a couple of weeks from now. I say, unfortunately, we'll be among those who will miss the women's game against USC. We'll be indisposed of in Indianapolis. I will be doing everything in my power to be back in time for the UCLA game on the Sunday. But yeah, again, I that's why I say I sympathize with season ticket holders, because you're put up in a tough spot. If not just outright losing an opportunity to go to one or multiple events because of it. But hopefully more people will turn out as the teams, as the seasons go on, and hopefully again the teams continue their success in order to entice more people to do that. But we'll chronicle that over the days and weeks to come for sure, and obviously go over this football game that brings just a little bit of significance, as we touched on before. And obviously look ahead to the Big Ten Championship game next week as well. A reminder for everybody to like, subscribe, 5-star review, all those things. So it helps more people to tune into the podcast, and also so it automatically sends into your feed, so you get Ducks Confidential along with all the other Oregonian sports podcasts as well. And a reminder for folks to send their questions into Ryan for his mailbag, both before and after the Big Ten Championship game, and of course this week and around basketball and the like. And Ryan, remind folks how to go about doing that.
Yep, on Blue Sky at Ryan T. Clark, same on Twitter/X, and then rclark@oregonian.com. That's Clark with an E. Hit me up with questions. Obviously, a lot to get into for UW this week, but then Big Ten Championship game and beyond. Exciting times, no doubt, for Oregon football. And then, on the women's basketball side, been following that team closely, and happy to answer questions as teams around the country and fans around the country get to know them.
So there you go. So that we will bid you adieu for this week. And again, we will chat next week, looking back at the rivalry game that was and looking ahead to the Big Ten Championship game and whoever the opponent may be. We'll see you next week.